Hello everyone, you're on the channel BL Story of Love, a channel that shows forbidden BL stories. Don't forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories you won't be able to tear yourself away from. Write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Every morning began the same way for Remy. Glass, light, silence. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse turned the world below into a moving painting. The city woke up in distant layers of noise that never quite reached him. Cars crawled along elevated highways like silver insects. Bridges cut the river into segments of dull metal. Billboards flickered. Planes took off near the horizon, drawing white scars across the sky. It was beautiful in the way screensavers were beautiful. Distant, untouchable. His world stopped at the line of reinforced glass and the doors where men in dark suits stood guard. They did not look at him unless they needed to. Their job was not to serve him, not really. They worked for one man, Lion Hartman, an alpha whose name was tied to expensive conflicts and even more expensive solutions. In the news, they called him a consultant, a strategist, a fixer. In private circles, his name moved money and changed decisions. Officially, Remy was his personal assistant. In practice, his role had long outgrown calendars and email. He lived in the penthouse instead of in a normal apartment. He rode in Lion's cars instead of public transport. He had a card that opened doors in private clubs and a badge that let him walk into meetings other assistants only heard about in gossip. On paper, it was a promotion, an impossible stroke of luck for an Omega from nowhere. He paid for it with the things that did not fit into any contract. He no longer had his own address. Time that belonged only to him. A passport he could keep in his own drawer. His documents stayed in the safe in Lion's office, behind a brushed steel door and a code only the Alpha knew. The story was always the same, polished by repetition. It was dangerous for Omegas to move around alone in this city. Better if someone responsible kept their papers and watched where they went. You are safer up here. The phrase had sounded kind the first time. Over the years, it turned into a small, blunt hammer, tapping away at his sense of ownership over his own life. The golden cage was tastefully furnished. Designer chairs, a sofa that could fit an entire team of lawyers, art on the walls picked by people with opinions, a kitchen stocked for a private chef, a gym on the roof with a view that made fitness influencers beg for invites. None of that changed what it was. A cage was still a cage, even if the bars were made of glass and chrome. Remy built small rituals to keep himself from dissolving into the decor. Most mornings, before the housekeepers appeared, he stood by the window with his coffee and studied the city like a map he might one day walk across. He marked bus routes by the colored lines on distant stops. He memorized where the main train station sat, how many streets away the long, low shape of the airport began. His eyes followed the same intersections again and again, learning the angles of escape the way other people learned office procedures. At night, when the penthouse went quiet and the smell of expensive cologne finally faded from the air, he took out his tablet and opened maps in dim mode. Fingers traced routes from here to the border, change to a bus here, cross a bridge there, reach a highway, then a station, then another city. It was a private game of pretend. In every route, there was a blank spot. Border control would want a passport. He would imagine himself standing in a line, handing over the small booklet that proved who he was. The image stopped there, catching on the fact that his passport sat locked in a safe in an office where he did not have permission to be alone. The fantasy snapped like a thread, and the map went dark under his thumb. Inside the penthouse, everything ran on a schedule that did not care about his inner maps. The housekeeper arrived at the same time each week, moving through rooms like a careful ghost. Security changed shifts according to a strict rotation, their footsteps in the corridor as regular as clock ticks. The kitchen produced meals on the hour, balanced plates designed by a nutritionist who had never met him. Even the plants on the balcony were trimmed according to a maintenance chart. Lion appeared and disappeared in this system like the owner of a private theater. Sometimes he was a presence felt more than seen. His voice in another room, the echo of a phone call, the low tension that filled the air before difficult meetings. Sometimes he was just there, crossing the living room, taking off his jacket, dropping his watch in a dish that cost more than Remy used to earn in a month. Remy's place in that ecosystem was harder to name. He was somewhere between guest, partner, and property. He arranged schedules, answered messages, stayed at Lion's side during long negotiations, listened and remembered details. At the same time, he was the person expected to be available whenever the Alpha needed anything, at any hour, without a life outside the glass walls. Fresh flowers appeared in vases before they wilted. Sheets smelled of starch and something clean that reminded him of hospitals. Devices were always the latest models. The only thing in the penthouse that felt genuinely old was his wish to cross the threshold, not because someone told him to, but because he chose to. Sometimes late at night, that wish became almost painful. He would wake up without knowing, padded by memory more than by sound, and walk barefoot through the dark apartment until the cold glass of the window stopped him. The city looked different at that hour. Less neon, more pockets of real darkness between pools of streetlight. Down there, someone walked home from a late shift. Someone argued under a flickering sign. Someone stood at a bus stop with a backpack and a ticket in their pocket, waiting to leave or to arrive. Their outlines were too small for him to see, but he felt them in the way headlights shifted, in the slow crawl of elevators in the towers across, in the red glow of crossing signals. He pressed his palm to the glass and imagined there was no security system, no cameras, no network of drivers who would report his movements within minutes. Just a door, just a street, just a pair of legs that could carry him wherever he wanted. For most people, that was ordinary freedom. You decided you wanted to walk, and you walked. You decided to move to another district, and you did, as long as you could pay the rent. Passports sat in drawers, forgotten until someone needed them for a trip. No one held them as leverage. No one wrapped concern around control and called it protection. For Remy, that simple right had turned into a luxury as rare as the wine in Lion's collection. He could touch glass. He could scroll maps. He could watch planes lift into the sky and shrink into dots. What he could not do was reach for a door handle without wondering which version of his life would slam shut behind it. The golden cage did not drop onto his life all at once. Years earlier, Remy had been just another Omega in an open plan office, tucked behind a monitor with a headset crooked over one ear. His days were made of spreadsheets, flight bookings, hotel confirmations, and polite reminders sent to clients who always answered too late. Lion Hartman existed then as a name on the logo above the entrance and as a shadow at the end of corridors, an alpha everyone talked about, but almost no one approached directly. Their paths crossed for the first time not because of destiny, but because a big client had very particular preferences. He wanted an assistant who could sit through endless negotiations without losing focus, someone who would understand what was being said but never try to take the spotlight. Remy was an easy choice. He was educated enough to follow complex conversations and quiet enough to be overlooked when alphas measured each other across the table. That first trip had felt like stepping onto a different planet. The car that picked them up was silent and expensive. The conference room sat high above the city, and the air smelled of coffee, printer toner, and faint alpha pheromones. Remy took notes, refilled water glasses, and watched how Lion operated. Calm, controlled, sharp. A man who could tilt a room with a single sentence. At some point during a break, Lion looked at him a little too long and said, almost to himself, "You listen." A few more trips followed, long days that dissolved into late dinners where business slowly bled into softer topics. Lion asked him about his studies, about why he had chosen this city, about what an Omega like him wanted from life. It sounded like casual curiosity. It felt like someone carefully mapping out where the weak points were. Remy answered honestly at first, flattered that the man at the top of the building even noticed him. The shifts began small and reasonable. An extra task after hours here, a personal errand there, a package to pick up, a reservation to fix when other staff had already gone home. "You're good at this," Lion would say, and Remy's chest tightened with a complicated warmth. In a world that told Omegas they were replaceable, being called indispensable by a powerful alpha was a dangerous kind of drug. Then came the suggestion that sounded like a favor. The commute from his rented room in the suburbs was long, unpredictable. Delayed trains, crowded buses, the constant worry of being an Omega alone late at night. Lion leaned back in his chair one evening and said, almost offhand, that there was a small corporate apartment closer to the office. Just until this project is done, no point wasting time on the road. It made sense. Remy told himself that it was temporary, that he could always move back. He packed a suitcase and left most of his things in the old room, paying rent for both places for a while. The city center apartment felt like a hotel, sterile but convenient. He slept better without the noise of distant traffic, woke up later, arrived at the office earlier. Productivity rose, praise followed, and little by little his old room turned into a place he visited, not a place he lived. When Lion one day asked with a light smile, "Why are you still paying for that other place? You never go there," the answer seemed obvious. It was wasteful, irrational. Remy handed the keys back to the landlord with shaky fingers and told himself he was shedding unnecessary weight. He did not notice at first that he had also shed one of the last independent anchors in his life. The move to the penthouse came dressed as a promotion, wrapped in words that were hard to refuse. He had proven his loyalty, his discretion, his ability to anticipate needs. Lion painted the idea in bright colors, a private room high above the city, access to the best clinic, bonuses transferred to his account, no more worries about rent or noisy neighbors. "You are not just staff anymore," the Alpha said. "You are part of my inner circle." It was intoxicating, that phrase, inner circle. Remy had spent most of his life on the outer edges of everything. Suddenly, he was being offered a place at the center. He moved again, bringing with him only the things that still felt like his: a few books, an old mug with a chipped handle, a worn sweatshirt from his student days. The rest of his life was replaced by carefully curated objects that matched the aesthetics of Lion's world. The next brick in the invisible wall came hidden inside a confidentiality clause. Lion's lawyers suggested that, given the sensitive nature of the clients he now handled, it would be better if his name disappeared from the regular employee registry. His salary would be paid through a separate contract, his role described in vague terms that meant nothing to outsiders. "It keeps you off radar," they said. "Nobody needs to know where you are or what you do." On paper, it was a security measure. In the corporate system, he stopped existing as a normal worker. No more name on office layouts, no more listing in the internal directory. If someone tried to look him up, they would find almost nothing. His legal footprint inside the company grew thinner, while his personal dependence on one Alpha thickened like rope. The passport was the last piece that slid into place without a sound. At first, Lion asked for it to arrange a visa for a foreign conference. Remy handed it over easily, happy that his job might take him beyond the country. The trip was postponed, then rescheduled, then replaced with a different deal that did not require travel. The passport, however, did not make its way back to his bedside drawer. When he asked, Lion laughed softly and tapped the safe in his office. "It is better here, less chance of losing it. If something happened to you out there, without papers, it would be a nightmare. This way, I know you are protected." Protected. The word settled over him like a warm blanket and a heavy chain at the same time. He nodded, because he had already grown used to trusting the rhythm of Lion's decisions, to believing that the Alpha knew better. Only much later, lying awake in the dark, did he understand that every "for your safety" had been another brick in the wall around him. From the outside, it all looked like the perfect success story for an Omega. He had gifts delivered to his door in sleek boxes, invitations to events other people only saw in magazines, a wardrobe tailored to his measurements, a place at tables where deals were made with a handshake. Colleagues whispered his name with a mixture of envy and awe. He had made it. Inside, a different feeling grew, patient and heavy. He could feel the outline of the cage even when no one mentioned it. Every privilege had an invisible condition attached. Access depended on obedience. Comfort depended on silence. His world functioned smoothly as long as he stayed within the lines drawn for him. The few times he pushed against them, even slightly, he met the same response: a cold, unreadable look, a quiet reminder of who paid the bills, who owned the car he rode in, who held his passport in a safe behind a code he did not know. The bars of his cage had been assembled over years, one reasonable decision at a time. By the moment he realized what had been built around him, the structure was already standing, polished and solid, with his own fingerprints all over every brick. Pregnancy did not arrive in his life as a dream of family. It arrived as a test strip between his fingers, cheap plastic and paper against polished stone. Lion was out of the city that day, flown to another meeting in another tower that looked just like this one. The penthouse was unnaturally quiet. No footsteps in the corridor, no low murmur of phone calls, no scent of fresh coffee from the kitchen. Only the distant hum of the ventilation and the faint echo of the city far below. Remy stood in the bathroom that looked like a page torn from a design magazine. White marble everywhere, soft hidden lights, chrome fixtures, a mirror tall enough to double the room. The test in his hand felt wrong in this space, like a cheap receipt laid on a grand piano. He had bought it in a clinic shop, slipping it into a basket with vitamins and bandages, hoping the cashier would not look too closely. He had carried it back up in his pocket, feeling its weight the whole ride in the private elevator. He had already followed the instructions. The strip lay on the edge of the sink, soaking in the evidence of his body. He had turned it face down, as if not seeing the result could delay it. Now the waiting time had passed, longer than the minutes on the box, stretched into something thick and airless. "Just look," he whispered to himself, and his voice bounced off the marble, sounding smaller than he felt. He flipped the strip over. 2 lines appeared fast and decisive, dark against the pale background, leaving no room for doubt. His stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hormones. Biology had done exactly what it was designed to do: an omega, a powerful alpha, regular heat cycles managed but not completely muted. The equation had always had this outcome in its list of possibilities. In another life, in another apartment, those 2 lines could have meant joy. A call to a friend, a trembling laugh, plans for names in tiny clothes, at the very least, a conversation between equals about what to do next. Here, in a bathroom that was not really his, each line looked like another link in a chain. His first reaction was not wonder, not even disbelief. It was fear that tightened his chest and pushed pins into his fingers. Not fear of the pregnancy itself, but of how it would be read by the one person whose reaction mattered more than any doctor's. Lion had never said clearly what he wanted from their relationship in the long run. There had been moments when he dismissed the idea of children with a quick, tired gesture, saying business left no time, that heirs tended to ruin empires more often than they saved them. There had been other nights when the city was just a blur of lights outside and his voice had gone softer, when he spoke about empty houses and meaningless affairs and how it would be good to leave something solid behind. Remy had learned not to trust either version fully. The truth about what Lion wanted lived somewhere between those moods, hidden behind layers of control. He leaned over the sink and looked at himself in the mirror. The harsh lights showed every small change he had tried not to name: the shadows under his eyes, the new heaviness in his chest, the way his skin flushed more easily. He had known something was different before the test. He had been more tired after ordinary days. The smell of certain foods had turned sharp and sickening, and sleep had become shallow, punctured by anxious waking. The penthouse, already too large for one person, had begun to feel even more hollow. Rooms he rarely used now looked like empty stages where someone else's life might play out. His reflection was a stranger in expensive cotton and fine stitching, and behind that stranger, inside his own body, something very small and very real had started to grow. He placed a hand against his flat stomach. There was no visible curve yet, but the gesture made the idea heavier. A life was starting there, whether he was ready or not, whether the world around him was safe or not. He imagined a child crawling across these polished floors, standing at the same windows, learning early that the doors always opened inward, never outward. "I will not give you another cage," he thought, and the thought scared him with its intensity. He wrapped the test in tissue, as if he could muffle what it meant, and dropped it into the small bin under the sink. The sound of plastic hitting plastic was indecently loud in the quiet room, telling Lion could not be delayed forever. His body would betray him soon enough, in blood tests, in scent, in the simple mathematics of months. Still, he waited. 1 hour, then another. He wandered from room to room, feeling the walls closer than ever, knowing that every step he took was borrowed time. When the call came from the airport, his voice cracked on the first word. Lion heard it. He always heard shifts in tone. Questions followed, clipped and calm. Was he sick? Had something happened? Remy forced the words out, each one tasting like stone. I am pregnant. There was a pause, long enough for the line to hiss softly in his ear. He braced for anger, for cold dismissal, for some version of fix-it that would cut through him. Instead, Lyon's response was controlled, almost businesslike. Arrangements, a doctor, tests, instructions to stay put, to rest, to eat. The word congratulations never came, but neither did rejection. Care arrived quickly, and it arrived as control. The best specialist in prenatal care for Omegas appeared in the penthouse the next day, armed with portable machines and a team that moved gently but firmly through his space. Blood work, scans, a detailed list of what he should and should not do. The living room turned into a private clinic for a day, cables and screens and soft beeps layered over the expensive furniture. You must not overexert yourself now, the doctor said, and Lyon repeated it later in almost the same tone. No stress, no unnecessary outings. On the surface, it was kindness, protection, a focus on health, his and the baby's. Underneath, the rules tightened. Security updated their schedules. His outings, already limited, were cut back further. The driver received new orders. Every movement was logged, every appointment pre-approved. Even his walks on the rooftop terrace were watched more closely. With this new status, Omega carrying a potential heir, the invisible bars of his life grew thicker. The cage became heavier and, in a bitter twist, more comfortable. Soft blankets appeared, special cushions for his back, prenatal vitamins lined up in glass jars on the counter. Meals were adjusted, lights dimmed automatically at night, noise reduced. Outside his body, everything was being arranged so that nothing could go wrong. Inside, a child developed cell by cell, heart beginning to form, tiny limbs budding in the dark. With every day that passed, Remy felt two things grow at once: the life inside him and the understanding that his chances of ever leaving were shrinking. He lay awake more often now, one hand resting on his abdomen, staring at the ceiling and listening to the hum of the building. The thought returned again and again. This is not a dream of family. This is the deepest proof of how trapped I am. And still, under all the fear and calculation, there was a quiet, stubborn flicker of feeling when he imagined a small hand closing around his finger. A fragile future pressed between walls he had not chosen, asking without words what kind of world he was going to build for it. Pregnancy changed more than Remy's body. It rearranged his thoughts, shifted the center of every plan he made, even the ones that never went beyond the walls of his mind. Before, when he imagined escape, the picture had been simple and selfish in a clean, desperate way. A light backpack, a cheap ticket bought in cash, a night bus that smelled of fuel and old upholstery, a border crossing where the officer barely looked up, stamped a passport, and waved him through. In those fantasies, he was alone. No one depended on him. If he failed, he was the only one who paid the price. Now there was always someone else in the frame, a child, not yet visible but solid enough in his imagination to sit beside him on every bus seat, to weigh down every route with questions. Where would they sleep? Who would treat them if something went wrong? What would happen if the border closed, if the wrong person noticed an unregistered Omega carrying a baby and understood how useful that could be? In the evenings, he still opened the map on his tablet, the screen dimmed so security cameras would not catch the glow. His fingers still traced lines out of the city, into neighboring regions toward crossings and ports. But the routes changed. He no longer searched only for speed. He searched for safety, for clinics marked with small red symbols, for consulates and shelters that might or might not exist outside glossy brochures. The more details he added, the more his old fantasies crumbled. He knew enough about the world beyond these windows to understand the risks. There were holding centers for undocumented Omegas near some borders, places dressed up in neutral language where people waited for processing that sometimes never came. There were strict migration laws that looked clean on paper and twisted in practice, leaving anyone without money or proof in a gray zone where rights were negotiable. Without access to Lyon's accounts, Remy had almost nothing. The savings on his own were small, not enough for private care, not enough for lawyers, not enough to survive long if doors slammed in his face. Every time he plotted a line toward safety, another line appeared crossing it, labeled with danger he could not ignore. Sometimes he tried to imagine another path, walking into the consulate of his home country, a building with white walls and a flag he had not looked at in years. In his mind, he sat in front of a bored official and explained that his employer held his passport, that he wanted to go home, that he was not free to leave. In that imagined office, he watched the official's expression barely change. The contract he had signed years ago did not mention force, did not forbid him from leaving. It spoke about confidentiality, benefits, housing. On paper, he was a highly compensated employee, not a prisoner. The story he wanted to tell fit poorly into the language of law. He saw himself trying to explain subtle control to someone who would only see the numbers on his payslips. "Why did you not leave earlier then?" the imagined official asked. There was no answer he could give that sounded solid enough to stand in a report. The more he leaned on this fantasy, the clearer it became that, legally, he looked like a man who had agreed to live in a golden cage and now regretted it. Regret was not grounds for intervention. Regret did not get you a fast track home. As his dependence on medical monitoring grew, the price of any misstep rose with it. Doctors visited regularly, checking blood pressure, hormone levels, the small heartbeat that appeared on the monitor like a soft flicker. They spoke about risk calmly, in numbers and probabilities, but every phrase translated in his head into something simple. Too much stress could hurt the baby. Lack of care could hurt the baby. A long journey in unstable conditions could hurt the baby. Any attempt to run now might cost not only his life, but the life forming inside him. His thoughts of flight turned sour around the edges. What had once been a source of secret comfort became a kind of punishment. The more vividly he imagined a bus station, a border crossing, a small rented room in another city, the sharper the pain when he admitted how unlikely it all was. He would close the map and feel as if he had picked up a knife and pressed it against his own ribs, just to see how much it took to bruise. There was only one kind of escape left to him that did not immediately threaten the child, the inner one. He began to divide himself into two layers. The outer layer moved through the penthouse with practiced ease, the obedient Omega who took his prescribed vitamins on time, attended every scan, nodded at Lyon's instructions, smiled politely at security. That version of him asked no difficult questions, did not repeat the word freedom out loud, stayed where he was told to stay. Beneath that smooth surface lived another Remy, one who watched everything and forgot nothing. That inner self counted how many guards were on each night shift, learned which elevator cameras were slow to refresh, noted which corridors fell into shadow when certain lights were turned off. He listened to names that slipped out during hurried phone calls, stored away the locations of files and the patterns of Lyon's anger and calm. In that private mental space, he let feelings breathe that had no place in the polished rooms. He allowed himself to be angry there, to think the words "this is wrong" without immediately smothering them with excuses. He let himself be afraid without smiling through it. He let himself imagine futures that did not begin and end at the same set of reinforced doors. Some nights he even pictured himself and the child somewhere else entirely, a place with chipped paint and second-hand furniture, where the air smelled of street food instead of expensive perfume. He knew these were only dreams, but refusing them felt like dying ahead of time. Outside his personal storm, another weather pattern formed. Lyon's business, so stable on the surface, had stepped into a conflict with partners who did not appreciate his reach. The signs arrived first as small shifts in tone during calls, then as concrete fragments in the news. Articles that carefully did not name him, but hinted at investigations. Rumors of leaks in financial circles, opponents testing how far they could push. The atmosphere in the penthouse thickened. Phones rang later and more often. Doors to the home office stayed closed longer. People Remy did not know by name came and went at strange hours, escorted by security with tighter jaws and shorter words. He heard raised voices once, cut off quickly behind soundproof glass. He saw the way guards scanned the street below with a new kind of tension. The place that had always been a cage now threatened to become a target. Remy understood that his position sat on top of shifting ground. The men who greeted him with polite respect in the hallway did so because he mattered to their employer. If the balance of power tipped, if Lion fell or fled or chose to cut weight to stay afloat, those same men could be the first to turn away. Protection was never about him as a person. It was about his connection to a man whose enemies were sharpening knives. He stood at the window one night, tablet dark in his hand, watching the city pulse and flicker. "Run," the inner voice said. "Stay," another answered, quieter but heavier. Both commands lived in his head, circling each other like animals in a too small space, knowing that for now there was nowhere for either of them to go. The crisis did not come only from the outside world. It rose from inside Remy's own body, from the place that was supposed to be safest. In the last weeks of the pregnancy, the doctor's tone changed. At first it was subtle. They frowned a little more at the monitor, spent longer watching the jagged green line of the baby's heartbeat. They asked the same questions in slightly different ways. Was he sleeping? Was he eating? Did he feel dizzy? Any pain? Any dreams? He was not sleeping, not really. Nights were a series of shallow dozes and sudden awakenings, soaked in sweat and worst-case scenarios. Food tasted of cardboard more often than not. His nerves hummed under his skin like a machine that had been running too hot for too long. Stress, lack of rest, the constant sensation of being pulled between danger outside and control inside had begun to write themselves into the tiny body he carried. Sometimes the baby's heart raced in sharp, anxious bursts. Sometimes it dipped lower than the chart liked. Each anomaly was small on its own, just a blip. Together they formed a pattern the doctors could no longer ignore. They started to use phrases like increased risk and emotional overload. They talked about the need to reduce his mental strain to an absolute minimum. No excitement, no conflicts, no uncertainty, as if those things could simply be turned off by a switch. For Lion, this medical language became something else. An argument. In his logic, the child growing inside Remy was both vulnerability and asset. On one side, a potential heir who could tie his name more firmly into the future, especially in a field where legacy mattered. On the other, a soft spot his enemies could aim at, a leverage point, a living pressure point. The Omega carrying that heir was, in the same calculus, a wild card. Dependent, yes. Bound by comfort and habit, yes. But also emotionally unstable, full of longing for freedom, carrying scars from a life before the penthouse that Lion could not fully map. That combination meant unpredictability in the long term, and unpredictability did not fit in his spreadsheets. The conversation that followed felt inevitable to Remy long before a single word was said. The air in the penthouse had carried the shape of it for days, legal staff moving in and out, low voices behind closed doors. A new file on the table in the home office, thick and heavy. When Lion finally called him in, the scene looked almost clinical. The doctor sat at one end of the table, hands folded neatly. Two lawyers occupied the other side, their pens aligned with the edges of their notepads. Screens were off, no distractions. The proposal was laid out in dry, precise language, as if they were talking about restructuring a division, not rewriting the course of 3 lives. After the birth, the child would be legally attached to Lion as the sole guardian and parent of record. Remy would sign a full renunciation of parental rights. In exchange, he would receive his freedom, financial compensation, and a carefully structured exit. The papers specified the details. An apartment in a safe city, far from current conflicts, bought in his name alone. A bank account funded enough to cover several years of living expenses, comprehensive medical insurance including therapy, assistance with relocation, integration, even language classes if he chose to leave the country entirely. On paper, it looked almost gentle, thoughtful. There were even annexes from mental health specialists, suggesting coping strategies for postpartum separation, as if grief could be managed with worksheets and breathing exercises. In reality, they were asking him to make a trade that felt like cutting out a piece of himself. Freedom, offered at last, but only if he paid for it by signing away every future claim to the child he had carried through months of fear and insomnia. A clean break, they called it. A way to protect everyone involved. Remy listened with his hands flat on the table, fingers pressed hard into the polished surface to keep them from trembling. As the lawyers spoke, his mind filled the sterile gaps between their phrases with images. the way the baby kicked when he played music. The first time he had seen the flicker on the ultrasound, that almost unreal pulse. The knowledge that somewhere, in the flickering lines of his own DNA, something would repeat in that small body. Inside him a conflict rose that did not fit into the measured tone of the room. On one side was fear for the child, raw and sharp. The world around Lion was dangerous, but it was also connected. He had access to protection, resources, people who would step in at a word. Lion could keep their son or daughter safe from threats Remy could not even see coming. He could pay for the best schools, the best doctors, a life without the hunger and uncertainty Remy had known. On the other side was a different fear. The fear of becoming the kind of man he had resented all his life, the kind who walked away from their own child and called it necessity. Remy's earliest memories of family were of absence. The institution where he had grown up had smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, its rooms full of children who had been signed away with strokes of pens. The thought of placing his own name under the same kind of form made his stomach twist. The doctor, perhaps sensing the balance tipping, cleared his throat and spoke up. He reminded them gently that the mother's emotional stability after birth had a direct impact on the baby's well-being, that sudden separation could have consequences for both. He mentioned options for gradual transition, for shared arrangements. His words dissolved against the harder surfaces in the room. The lawyers returned to their key points: safety, clarity, legal neatness, no disputes later, no custody battles, no opportunities for hostile parties to exploit a bond between an Omega with a complicated past and a child with a powerful name. Lion sat back and listened, his expression smooth, but his eyes gave him away. They were fixed on Remy with the intensity of someone who had already chosen a course and was now waiting for others to fall into line. This is the only way to keep control, his gaze seemed to say, even if his mouth did not. For Remy, the proposal was not just a contract. It was a mirror held up to the core of who he was. For so long, his private dream of escape had been a lifeline. The idea that someday he could walk away from the golden cage and breathe on his own. Now that dream stood face to face with the terror of losing his child entirely. He found himself, for the first time in years, not drawn to the windows and their distant views, but pulled inward, to the quiet space where his truest voice lived. In that silence, a question formed that no one in the room could answer for him. Who did he want to be in his own story? The one who finally found the courage to leave, carrying nothing but scars and a key to a modest apartment in another country? Or the one who chose to stay chained to the cage because the child born inside it needed at least one parent who knew how it felt to grow up without choices? Between those two versions of himself, there was no solution that did not hurt. Only a condition offered instead of salvation, packaged neatly, that said, "You may be free if you agree to cut yourself in half." The decision did not arrive overnight. It thickened slowly, like fog over the city, seeping into every corner of the penthouse until it felt as if the walls themselves were waiting for his answer. Printed pages lay scattered across the coffee table and the bed, tidy at first, then shuffled, then stacked again. Legal clauses, medical reports, risk assessments. Remy read them in circles, tracing the same sentences until the ink might as well have been carved into his skull. He tried to separate what was rational from what was emotional, as if those two things ever lived in different rooms inside him. Each paragraph described a future in clean terms: address, account, insurance, support. Every line about his new life collided with a question that did not appear anywhere in the text. Could he live with himself after signing? Pregnancy was moving toward its critical edge. The doctors talked about weeks in careful voices, about lungs that needed just a little more time, about a heart that beat too fast when he was stressed. They repeated their advice with increasing firmness. End the uncertainty. Decide. Settle what can be settled so the mind can rest. Lion, on his side, kept his tone even. He did not raise his voice, did not slam doors, did not threaten. He simply made it clear, in those measured words of his, that the plan would not change. He would not drag Remy by force to the table, but he would also not reopen negotiations. The world around them leaned in, watching, as if this were only another contract waiting for a signature at the bottom. The internal break happened not while he was staring at the renunciation form, but when he saw his own name in a different document entirely. It was buried in a confidential report, a line item in a column of potential weaknesses. There, next to 3 cold words, stood his surname. Risk factor, no commentary, no insult. Just a category. For the analysts who had written it, he really was that. A variable that might disrupt stability. A person whose emotional ties could be used against the company, against Lyon, against the future of the child. They did not know his face, his voice, the way his hand shook when he held an ultrasound photo. They knew only the logic of vulnerability. For Remy, seeing himself reduced to that label was like looking into a distorted mirror. It reflected back something he had felt, but never named. If he stayed, he would not just love the child, he would be the pressure point everyone watched, the living lever others could pull. The idea of his presence being used as a weapon against his own son or daughter made his skin crawl. The day chosen for signing dawned unnaturally clear. The sky above the city was an almost artificial blue, stripped of its usual smog and haze, as if the world had decided to remove all visual noise for this one moment. In Lyon's office, 3 objects were placed neatly on the desk, like props in a carefully staged scene. A thick folder with the contract and all attachments. A single metal key, cool and plain, attached to a small tag with an address in another city. And a sealed envelope that held a ticket, a path already sketched out in rail lines and departure times. The city chosen for his new life had been picked with the same precision Lyon applied to business moves, far enough to minimize chance encounters with old clients or enemies. Quiet enough that an Omega, with or without a child, could blend into the background and live without feeling a gun barrel pressed between his shoulder blades, big enough to offer anonymity, small enough to promise a slower kind of threat. Remy sat down in the chair opposite the contract and took a breath that did not reach the bottom of his lungs. He had gone over every clause with a lawyer assigned to him, someone nominally independent, who had nodded and said the terms were generous. On a purely technical level, they were. No one had advice for what to do with the part of him that wanted to tear the pages in half. He picked up the pen. The paper felt heavier than it looked, as if all the future weight of his choice already sat inside it. He signed the first page, then the second, his hand moving almost automatically through sections that dealt with property transfer, relocation services, confidentiality. He paused every few lines, rereading phrases he already knew by heart because a small part of him still hoped to find some loophole that would make the whole structure collapse. Nothing did. The form renouncing his parental rights waited near the end. The heading was bland, almost bureaucratically kind. It spoke of voluntary decisions, understanding of consequences, commitment to the child's best interests. The language was so careful that it scraped against his nerves. His fingers tightened around the pen until they hurt. The black line waiting to be drawn across that small rectangle at the bottom might as well have been a blade. For them, he thought. For them, not for him, not for this house, not for this name. His hand trembled once. Then he set the nib down and pulled the ink through the white space, forming the shape of his name one last time in connection with this child on any official record. The moment the pen lifted, the room seemed to fall into a brief, unnatural silence. The faint noises of the city, the hum of ventilation, the soft shift of someone's chair all dropped away. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the knowledge that he had just done something that could not be undone with a simple, "I changed my mind." He laid the pen down carefully, as if it were fragile. The lawyers moved forward to collect the papers, their hands efficient and impersonal. The doctor glanced at him with a look he could not quite read, somewhere between pity and professional approval. Lyon remained still for a moment longer, his eyes on the signature, not on Remy's face. Then, the contract disappeared into a folder, snapped shut by a precise gesture. The choice was no longer floating above them. It was anchored in ink. The key came next, placed in his palm without ceremony, a small piece of metal that represented walls he had not yet seen, doors he had not yet opened. It lay there heavier than it should, the cold pressing into his skin. To anyone else it would have looked like an ordinary key, nothing special. To him, it was both a symbol of freedom and a reminder of what that freedom had cost. "This is yours," someone said quietly. "Yours." The word rang false and true at the same time. The apartment it unlocked would be in his name, his space, his bed, his cupboard. No one would be able to walk in without his permission. At the same time, every time he slid this key into a lock, he would remember another door that stayed closed, in another city, behind which his child would grow up without him. The envelope rustled softly when they placed it beside the key. Inside was the ticket. Route, time, seat, a thin rectangle of card that would carry him out of the cage, at least physically. He did not open it yet, just traced the edges with his thumb, feeling the sharp corners. He knew the logic. A fixed date, a fixed departure, less room to hesitate. Once he boarded that train or plane, the machinery of distance would begin to work in his favor, putting miles between him and the life he had just signed away. His experience whispered a different truth. Bodies moved faster than hearts. You could cross borders, change languages, throw away every object that tied you to a place, and still find your mind standing in front of a window in a city you no longer lived in. Remy closed his fingers around the key and the envelope, hiding them in his fist. From the outside, it looked like he was simply accepting what he had been given. Inside, something had shifted. He was no longer the man who waited by the glass, dreaming of escape without a plan. He was now the man who had chosen a brutal surgical kind of freedom, one that cut through bone and left a scar that would never truly fade. He stood up from the chair slowly, aware that the next steps he took would lead him away from this office, this building, this life. The path ahead was as real as the cold weight in his hand. The part he did not yet know how to walk was the one inside him, where every step forward would always cast a shadow that looked like a small hand reaching back from the other side of a closed door. After the signing, time narrowed into a handful of days. The doctors and coordinators agreed quickly that there was no reason to wait for nature to decide on its own. Every extra surge of stress, every restless night, was another small risk added to a list already too long. They scheduled the operation in calm voices, inked it into their calendars, and left him inside the penthouse like an actor kept on stage after the audience had gone home. The space felt wrong in those days, too quiet in some corners, too loud in others. The same furniture, the same artwork, the same polished stone, yet everything carried the echo of something finished. Remy moved from room to room without much purpose, noticing details his mind had skipped over before. A small scratch on a table leg, a faint stain in the corner of a rug, the way the light fell differently in late afternoon, catching dust in the air that the cleaners never quite reached. He found himself drawn, again and again, to the nursery. They had started putting it together almost as soon as the first blood tests confirmed the pregnancy. At the time, he had tried to keep his distance from it, to think of the room as part of a project that did not truly belong to him. Designers discussed themes and palettes. Lions signed off on catalogs. Deliveries arrived in anonymous boxes that unfolded into pieces of someone else's future. Now, with the operation looming close, the nursery had shifted in his mind. It was no longer just the outcome of a plan he had not written. It had become a condensed version of everything that might have been, if his life had taken a different shape. He stepped over the threshold and paused. The walls were painted in a soft, neutral shade that looked almost like warm paper. Shelves lined one side, filled with stuffed animals, wooden toys, and picture books whose pages had not yet been turned. Tiny clothes were folded with military precision in open drawers, tags still attached, sizes marked for months that had not yet started. By the window stood the crib, its bars smooth and pale, a mobile hanging above it with small figures that turned lazily when the air moved. He walked to the middle of the room and stood there, feeling his chest tighten. Each object had been placed with a specific moment in mind. There was a chair in the corner for long nights when the baby would not sleep, a soft mat on the floor for the first unsteady attempts to crawl, rattles sized for small fists that would one day reach out with startling purpose. All those imagined nights and days would unfold without him now. The thought landed with a dull weight, not sharp enough to make him cry, but heavy enough to bend him inward. He reached out and ran his fingers along the edge of the crib. The wood was smooth, almost silky with varnish. He tried just for a second to picture himself sitting here, half asleep, a child pressed against his chest while dawn crept into the room. The image came with painful ease and then snapped away, replaced by the reality written in ink. He was not meant to be part of these scenes. By the time the crib held a sleeping body, he would be somewhere else, opening a different door with a different key. The lawyers, in their careful thoroughness, had thought about what he could and could not take from this room. They had insisted that he be allowed one small token, framed as emotional support. Something to hold on to without, as they put it, blurring the legal clarity of his renunciation. One toy, one object, one permitted connection. The limitation felt almost absurd in its control, yet he clung to it as if it were a lifeline. He began to look around with new eyes, not as a ghost drifting through someone else's future, but as a man forced to choose which single thread he was allowed to carry out. He paced slowly along the shelves. There were brand new plush animals lined up in a neat row, their fur untouched, their eyes still bright and identical. A stack of fabric cubes embroidered with letters. A soft blanket with a faint pattern of clouds. Any of them could have been the choice. Any could have been the object he held later, proof that this child had once existed in his arms, even if the world refused to admit it. His gaze kept circling back to one toy near the end of the shelf, a small teddy bear, its fur a little more worn than the others, its ears slightly flattened as if someone had pinched them many times. It did not match the newer plush animals, which were all from the same expensive brand. This bear belonged to another set of memories. Remy remembered the day it appeared. Lion had come back from a trip carrying a box of old things from his family home, items he had never bothered to unpack before. He had opened it in a rare, unguarded mood, pulling out objects and dismissing or keeping them in quick movements. At some point, he had held up the bear, looked at it for a long moment, and without quite meeting Remy's eyes, muttered that he had always thought he would give it to his child one day. Then he had placed it on the nursery shelf before the room was even fully painted. That detail lived only in Remy's mind. For everyone else, the bear was just another soft shape in a carefully curated arrangement. For him, it was a bridge between Lion's past and the future that now belonged to the baby alone. His hand lifted almost before he realized he had decided. He reached out and took the bear from the shelf. The fabric was softer than it looked, warmed a little by the constant sunlight that reached this wall. Under his fingers, the worn patches on the ears felt like proof that someone had once held it tightly, slept with it, dragged it across floors. The bear felt too alive, too full of unspoken stories, for something that was supposed to be just an object. "This one," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The doctor standing by the door, there as a witness and a guardian of boundaries, nodded once. He made a small note on his tablet, confirming that Remy had exercised his allotted choice. No legal line had been crossed, no additional claim could be inferred from a single toy. Remy looked around the nursery again with the bear in his hand. Without that small, worn shape on the shelf, the room seemed even more staged. The new toys looked emptier, all bright colors and untouched textures, like props waiting for actors who had not yet been cast. The crib was just furniture. The mobile spun slowly above it, silent, its tiny figures never having been batted at by inquisitive hands. It was as if, by taking the bear, he had pulled out the only thread that connected this space to something real, to a history that did not begin with interior designers and carefully drafted shopping lists. The rest stayed. The carefully folded clothes for the first winter. The tiny shoes that no newborn would wear for months, bought anyway because someone had liked how they looked. The shelves of toys that would soon be scattered across the floor and stuffed under furniture. All of it belonged to the life he was already stepping out of, even though his body had not yet left the building. He stepped back over the threshold, bear pressed against his palm. Behind him, the nursery waited, quiet and complete, ready for a child who would never know that on one afternoon, before they were even born, their other parent had stood in the middle of the room and chosen the only piece of it they were allowed to carry into exile. Preparing to leave looked simple from the outside. One small suitcase, a couple of soft bags, a folder of documents, the key and the ticket. It could have been a weekend trip, a quick change of scenery before returning to the same bed, the same wardrobe, the same view. For someone who had spent years in a space where every object had been chosen and paid for by someone else, the act of packing became something else entirely. It became a question. What was actually his, and what had only been draped over him like a costume? His body told him that time had already moved on. The curve of his stomach was gone, replaced by soreness and a tender line under bandages, a scar that pulled when he reached too far. His arms carried a phantom weight at odd moments, as if they still remembered the brief time they had held more than just air. The silence of the penthouse after the hospital felt larger, sharper, as if the walls were waiting for a sound that would now never come from his room. He opened the wardrobe and faced a row of garments that could have belonged to a mannequin. Suits cut to flatter, shirts in precise colors that matched Lyon's preference for understated luxury, shoes without a scuff on them. On another rail hung more casual clothes, but even those had been curated to fit an image. Elegant, neutral, flawless. Half of what he saw had never really been his. He had worn these clothes, walked into meetings in them, sat at Lyon's side in them. They were part of the persona built around him, the silent message that he belonged in certain rooms. Standing alone in front of the wardrobe, he saw them differently. They were uniforms for a job he no longer held, armor for a role he was done playing. "Not that," he murmured, pushing aside a jacket that still smelled faintly of cologne and conference halls. He reached toward the back of the wardrobe, where a few pieces from his previous life had survived the upgrade. A worn hoodie with frayed cuffs, soft from too many washes and cheap detergent. A pair of jeans that did not fit the penthouse aesthetic, but fit his body in a way tailored cloth never really had. A simple sweater in a color he had chosen himself once, long before anyone had opinions about his palette. Those went into the suitcase first. He folded them carefully, as if they were more fragile than the silk shirts he left hanging. Next came a handful of plain t-shirts, underwear, socks, practical things that did not shout any particular story about the man who wore them. He wanted to arrive in his new city as someone unremarkable, someone whose clothes did not betray the fact that he had once lived in a tower. From a drawer, he pulled out a small notebook, its cover creased, pages cluttered with half-legible handwriting. Notes from meetings, yes, but also fragments of thoughts, names of places he had wanted to look up, sketches of escape routes drawn in the margins. He hesitated, then added it to the suitcase. It was a record of the person he had been while pretending to be someone else. In the back of another drawer, he found a thin envelope of photographs. Real, printed photos, not files hidden on a device that could be wiped remotely. There were only a few. A shot of a cramped room he had once rented, plants on a narrow windowsill. A blurry picture of him and another Omega from his first job, laughing at something outside the frame. A city street from his home country, captured on a winter day, breath visible in the air. He stared at that last one for a long time before tucking the whole stack between two shirts. The images were proof that his life had not started in this penthouse, that there had been other versions of him, other settings, before Lyon's World had tried to rewrite his story. Most of the clothes stayed on their hangers, the suits, the shirts, the neat shoes. They hung there like the empty skins of a character he no longer intended to inhabit. He closed the wardrobe door without looking back, as if shutting a stage costume closet. The bear from the nursery did not go into the suitcase. He placed it in his carry-on bag, inside but near the top, where his hand could find it quickly. The idea of burying it under layers of fabric made something twist in his chest. He was afraid that if he let it disappear among other belongings, it might turn into just another object, instead of what it had become to him, a bridge between two irreconcilable parts of his life. Sometimes, when he touched the worn ear, he felt connected to three people at once. To Lyon, the child he had been when he held this bear. To the baby, who would grow up in this apartment without ever knowing that their other parent had chosen this one toy as a way to keep them close. And to himself, walking into an unknown city with the quiet, stubborn proof that this story was real, no matter what the paperwork said. Farewell to the penthouse did not come with speeches or glasses raised. There was no ritual to mark the end. Lyon spent most of those days on calls and in closed-door meetings, his attention caught by the consequences of his own decisions in the business world. They crossed paths only a few times in corridors, a flicker of eye contact, a small tilt of the head. In those brief exchanges floated words neither of them spoke aloud. Thank you. I'm sorry. You chose this. So did you. Exhaustion, defensiveness, the human debris of a bond that had never been simple enough to name. The last night, sleep did not come. Remy walked through the apartment in slow loops, as if memorizing it for an exam he would never take. He noted the way the hallway lights softened near the floor. The sound the elevator made when it arrived on this level, a low mechanical sigh. The measured pacing of the guards beyond the front door, their boots quiet on the thick carpet but still recognizable after so many years. He paused in the kitchen, hand resting on the cool countertop where so many carefully prepared meals had been set down in front of him. In the living room, he studied the pattern of the city lights reflected in the black glass of the television. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence that had replaced the small, private noises of pregnancy. He tried to understand what he would miss. The answer resisted any simple yes or no. He would not miss the feeling of being watched, measured, managed. He would not miss the invisible rules that had fenced him in at every turn. But there were fragments of this place he knew would ache like old injuries in bad weather. He would miss the rare hours when the penthouse had felt almost like a sanctuary, when Lion was away and the city below stopped being a boundary and turned into a horizon. He would miss the evening light on the river, the way the sky sometimes went the color of bruised peaches before a storm. He might even miss the strange comfort of a routine that had, for all its limits, kept him alive. What he would not miss was the cage itself. Morning came gray and clean. The call from security arrived exactly on time, a polite reminder that the car was waiting in the garage. Remy closed the suitcase, testing the weight with one hand. It was lighter than he had expected. There were not many things inside. That was not why it felt light. The truth was that all the heaviest parts of his life remained in this building. The role he had played, the expectations he had tried to meet, the unspoken script that said his freedom belonged to someone else's schedule. The child whose first breaths had filled this air. He picked up the carry-on bag, feeling the small solid shape of the bear against his side, and stepped toward the door. The things that did not fit in a suitcase would not vanish when he crossed the threshold. They would travel with him in the only place that had ever been truly his, inside his own skin. The trip from the penthouse to the closed terminal should have taken only a handful of minutes. On any other day, it would have been a blink in the schedule, a small gap between one obligation and the next. That morning it stretched inside him like a lifetime, every second dragging its own echo. The elevator doors slid open with their usual soft sigh. Remy stepped in, suitcase at his side, carry-on strap cutting into his shoulder. The bear sat in the crook of his arm, his fingers wrapped around its narrow torso, thumb tracing the worn seam between head and body. He watched the numbers above the doors change, floor after floor, and tried not to think about how many times he had done this ride in the other direction, going up instead of down. When the doors opened at the lobby level, he expected to see only security. Men in suits, the car waiting, the usual choreography. He did not expect Lion. The Alpha stood on the landing outside the elevator, one hand in his pocket, the other resting loosely against the railing. He looked like someone who had not slept properly in far too many nights. The sharp lines of his face were dulled by exhaustion, shadows under his eyes making his usual control look brittle. The tie was there, the pressed shirt, the tailored jacket, but the armor did not hide the strain. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. The space between them had once been full of words, work details, requests, jokes that pretended not to be intimate, arguments that tried not to dig too deep. Now it held only quiet, thick and tight, as if sound itself had decided it did not belong here anymore. Remy felt his throat close around all the things he could have said. Thank you. You hurt me. I knew this would happen. I did not think it would feel like this. None of them made it past his teeth. They hovered there, bitter and useless. Lion's gaze dropped for a moment, not to the suitcase, not to the folder of documents under Remy's arm, but to the small shape of the teddy bear. Recognition flickered across his face, fast and unguarded. Of all the objects Remy might have chosen, he had taken the one that came not from a catalog, but from Lyon's own childhood box. In that instant, more passed between them than in any carefully crafted promise. The Alpha understood exactly what symbol Remy was taking with him, a piece of his past, a thread to the child, a quiet refusal to let the story be entirely written by legal language. He did not argue, did not reach out to take it back. Instead, he straightened slightly and made a small, almost formal gesture toward the doors leading to the private garage. An invitation, a command, a last shared action. "Go," he said, barely louder than a breath. The word hit harder than shouting would have. Remy nodded once. His feet moved before his chest caught up. He passed close enough that he could have brushed against Lyon's sleeve, could have reached for his hand, his arm, the edge of his jacket. He did not. Neither did Lyon. They were two men passing in a narrow space, careful not to collide. Lyon did not follow him down to the car. He did not get into the back seat, did not sit beside him for one last ride, did not walk him to the gate. His frame stayed in the doorway at the top of the stairs, a tall silhouette cut out against the brighter light of the lobby. As the security guard opened the garage door and the cooler air rose up to meet them, Remy felt that shadow behind him more than he saw it. It was the outline of a life he was leaving, not entirely by his own choice, not entirely against it. In the garage, everything ran like a well-rehearsed routine. The black car waited with its engine already on, the driver at his post. Two guards hovered at the edges, eyes scanning, hands busy with earpieces and quiet confirmations. They took his suitcase, stowed it in the trunk with professional care. They checked his documents with a speed that spoke of practice, then transmitted details to someone unseen on the other end of a secure line. Their tone suggested this was just another transport of a high-value individual. No raised eyebrows, no strange looks. In their world, moving important people from place to place was a job like any other. Only the absence of a return entry in their schedules hinted at anything different. On their lists there was a departure time, no arrival slot back in this garage, no second line with his name. Remy slid into the back seat, the bear still in his arms. The leather smelled familiar, a mix of upholstery, air freshener, faint traces of other journeys. The door closed with a heavy sound that felt more final than any signature. Through the tinted glass he caught one last glimpse of Lyon at the top of the stairs. The Alpha had not moved. For a moment, Remy let himself believe that if he opened the door and stepped out again, if he walked back up, something could still be changed. The thought was gone before the car began to roll. The ramp to the street tilted them upward. Then they were out in daylight. They followed routes Remy knew by heart. The same turn past the park, the same intersection where the traffic lights were always a little too short, the same stretch of elevated road where the city opened on both sides, buildings rising like glass cliffs. He had looked at these views countless times from Lyon's side, ready to brief him before a meeting or debrief after a deal. Today, he was not a shadow at someone's elbow. He was cargo being taken out of a life. The driver talked softly into his headset, confirming times, checkpoints, clearances for the closed terminal near the airport where security procedures were faster and questions fewer. The words blurred together in Remy's ears. He watched the familiar skyline slide by and felt as if he were watching someone else's memories on a screen. Inside, something shifted with each kilometer. He had left behind more than just a child he would not raise. Somewhere on those upper floors remained the version of him that believed love and control could coexist, that thought he could negotiate with a man like Lyon and come out whole. He had handed over the illusion that he could fix this by being better, quieter, more patient. The belief that if he proved himself endlessly loyal, he would be rewarded with real autonomy, not just a nicer cage. What he carried now, besides the suitcase and the bear, was an uncomfortable emptiness. A stretch of life ahead where no one had written a script for him, where he would not wake up to a pre-planned day, a list of tasks, a set of expectations he could at least try to meet. He slid his free hand into his pocket and felt the key press against his fingers, cold and solid. In the inner pocket of his coat, the envelope with the ticket rustled when he moved. One represented a door he had not yet seen, The other represented the path that would take him there. They were both promises and accusations. Here is your exit. Here is what it cost. The car took an exit lane that led away from the public arrivals and departures. Fences rose on either side, topped with cameras and quiet warnings. The terminal ahead was low and discreet, hidden behind neutral walls. No bustling crowds, no bright advertisements. This was a place people passed through when others did not need to know. As they slowed to approach the checkpoint, Remy tightened his hold on the bear and looked straight ahead. The weight in his chest did not lessen. It simply settled into a new shape. He was leaving a city, a penthouse, an alpha, a child he had held for too few hours. He was also leaving behind the man who had believed that staying would make any of it safer. What waited beyond the terminal doors was unknown. What lay behind him was fixed, locked in safes and files and nursery walls. The road between was the only part that still belonged to him, and even that would be measured in a handful of careful minutes. He drew a slow breath as the car rolled to a stop. This was not the end of the story, he told himself, even if it felt like the closing of a book. It was just the moment where one life ended in practice and another began in the quiet space where no one yet knew his name. The route to the border had been chosen with the same precision as any of Lyon's deals. No main hubs, no places where journalists might be lurking, no unnecessary eyes. Officially, Remy was being transferred for treatment in another country. The paperwork told that story cleanly. Medical certificates, specialist referrals, a letter from a doctor explaining that continued care abroad was recommended. From the outside, it looked compassionate. The driver had been briefed until he could have recited the checkpoints in his sleep, which lane to take at each toll, where to slow down for cameras, whom to call if a border guard asked the wrong kind of question. He handled the wheel with the calm of someone who had driven important people out of sight many times before. They left the closed terminal and slid onto the highway. At first, the city still pressed close. Glass and concrete rose in layers, reflective surfaces catching the light like blades. Suddenly, Remy saw it not as the stage of his gilded imprisonment, but as a living thing he was being expelled from, cell by cell. His phone lay in the console beside him, dark. The internal company profile had been wiped as soon as he signed. Contacts vanished, secure applications locked behind deactivated keys. Without the network that had once tied him to Lyon's world, it had turned into an ordinary device, full of blank spaces where names used to be. He could still dial emergency numbers, order a taxi, search weather in cities he had never seen. He could no longer reach anyone who knew who he had been inside that glass tower. He glanced up at the rearview mirror. The guard in the front passenger seat caught his eye for a second, then looked away. In the city, they had always carried that unshakable confidence that came from working for a man whose influence could bend procedures. Out here, closer to a line on a map no one corporation truly owned, even they seemed thinner around the edges. Here they depended on different people. Border officers who did not care about corporate hierarchies. Civil servants with the power to hold a passport and say no. For once, Remy and his escort were subject to the same external rules. The landscape began to loosen as they drove. The tight cluster of towers gave way to lower buildings, warehouses, apartment blocks sprayed with graffiti. Then came the suburbs, houses with small fenced yards, laundry hanging on lines, dogs barking at the passing car. The further they went, the more color faded from the world. The advertising billboards grew sparser. The road straightened, slicing through flat fields that stretched on both sides. He watched it all through the tinted glass, feeling the distance inside his chest widen with each kilometer. The city that had contained his life for so long shrank in the side mirrors, then disappeared behind a low curve of land. On the seat beside him lay the bear. He had meant to put it in his bag, but somehow it had ended up next to him, upright against the leather as if it were a small passenger. Every so often his hand moved of its own accord, fingers brushing the worn ear, the matted patch of fur on its chest. Each touch grounded him in a different moment, the dusky light of the nursery. The doctor's quiet nod as he chose the toy, the dry rustle of paper when he had slid his signature under the line that severed him from his child in the eyes of the law. Do not lose it, he thought, the phrase rising with unbidden urgency. If you lose this, You lose proof it happened. His body reminded him with every curve of the road that not much time had passed since the birth. The scar across his lower belly tugged when the car went over a bump. His muscles ached with the fatigue of someone who had spent too many nights gripping pain instead of sleeping. His chest felt tight and oddly heavy, a phantom echo of a process medicine had cut short. The physical pain was clear, almost honest. A straightforward outcome of flesh cut and stitched, of organs strained, of hormones surging and dropping. It said, "You went through something hard, and now you are healing." It had edges, limits, medication that took the worst of it away. The other pain did not respond to anything the doctors had left in the bathroom cabinet. It sat deeper, a slow burn behind his ribs made of choices that could not be undone and futures that would never happen. It whispered at him in the rhythm of the tires on asphalt. You signed. You walked out. You left. The driver switched lanes to overtake a truck. Beyond the narrow barrier, fields rolled by, dusted with the pale green of new growth. Far off, he could see a line of trees marking a river. On the other side of that water, another jurisdiction began. Someone else's rules, someone else's map. They passed through small towns whose names Remy barely registered. A petrol station shimmered in the heat at the edge of one village, children holding ice creams near the forecourt, a bored clerk slumped behind glass. A roadside cafe flashed by, plastic chairs, a chalkboard with a menu written in hurried letters. Lives happening at ground level, untouched by the contracts that had sliced his own life apart. The closer they drew to the border, the more dense the signs became. Speed limits, distance markers, notices in 2 languages warning of crossing points ahead. Official symbols that reduced the complicated reality of nations to neat icons and numbers. His phone buzzed once on the console, a generic alert about roaming charges. It was almost laughable. The system recognized that he was approaching a line on a map and wanted to remind him that data would cost more on the other side. Data, yes. Everything else, immeasurably. Up ahead, the traffic began to slow. A ripple of red brake lights spread along the lane like a wave. The driver eased off the accelerator, muttered something neutral into his headset, and they rolled forward in hesitant bursts. Remy leaned slightly to see past the front seats. The border point rose in front of them, a cluster of booths and barriers under a wide metal canopy. Lanes separated cars and buses, trucks and priority vehicles. Flags cracked sharply in the wind. Cameras watched each line of vehicles inching forward. Loudspeakers crackled, announcing something he did not fully catch. In front of their car, families waited with the resigned impatience of people used to this kind of pause. Children leaned against windows, engrossed in screens or games. A toddler in the back of a hatchback beat a plastic toy against the glass, laughing. A couple in a compact car took turns yawning and sipping from a shared bottle of water. A man in a business suit checked his watch, checked his messages, checked his watch again. For them, this strip of asphalt and painted lines was an interruption, a checkpoint between here and a holiday, between here and a conference, between here and a relative's house. They would show their documents, answer a few questions, maybe open a suitcase if asked. Then they would drive on, their thoughts already on the beach, the hotel, the meeting room. For him, this was a cut. The place where one version of his life would end not just practically, but symbolically. On one side of this barrier lay the city where his child would grow up, where the penthouse with its nursery and sliding doors and safe full of documents would keep turning without him. On the other side lay a country where he would be just another foreigner with a medical file and a bank account, where no one knew that he had once carried a piece of one of the most feared alphas in his body. The car edged forward, the booth growing larger in the windshield. He became aware of his breathing, too shallow. He tried to copy the rhythm the therapist had once shown him in a session disguised as a routine checkup. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count to 4, to 6. The numbers steadied him, even as they marked each step closer. The bear slid a little on the seat when the car stopped again. He steadied it, resting his hand on its head. The worn fur was warm now, heated by the weak sunlight and the heat from his own skin. He imagined, for a flicker of a second, a future scene on the other side of the border. A small apartment, a narrow bed, him alone with this toy on the nightstand, staring at the ceiling. wondering if, at that same moment, a child in the city he had left was reaching for a different bear, a different comfort, never knowing they shared this strange, broken connection. A horn sounded briefly somewhere behind them, angry, then cut off. The line moved. The border from the outside was just an arrangement of metal and glass, uniforms and stamps. From the inside of the car, in the tight space between his ribs and his spine, it had become something more. A line on a map, yes, but also a fault line over which his life had been split into before and after. He watched the last few meters shrink with the sinking certainty that once they crossed, even turning back physically would not put anything truly back where it had been. For the people around him, this crossing was a temporary formality. For Remy, it was the moment his child remained forever on one side of a world he could no longer claim, while he was carried, helpless and awake, toward another. The border hall met him with a light that seemed too bright to be natural. Rows of fluorescent lamps hummed overhead, casting everything in a flat, almost colorless glow. The air smelled of metal, recycled air, and a faint trace of disinfectant, the same generic sterility that clung to hospitals and bureaucratic buildings. Lines of people moved in slow, segmented motions between metal barriers. Shoes scraped against the floor, trolleys rattled. Scanners beeped in a steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat for a place where nothing personal was supposed to matter. Put your things in the tray, step forward, wait, answer, step aside. Remy joined the flow, folded into a stream of travelers who had nothing to do with his story. Ahead of him, a family corralled 2 sleepy children and 3 overstuffed suitcases. Behind him, someone tapped a passport against their palm, impatient, casting glances at the clock. Everyone was performing the same small ritual of movement and waiting, as if they had rehearsed it together. He held the folder of documents in one hand, the strap of his bag cutting across his shoulder. The papers inside told a clean, stripped-down version of who he was. Name, date of birth, citizenship, a letter from a doctor outlining his need for ongoing treatment. Nowhere in those neat paragraphs did it say that he had left a newborn child behind walls he had once called home. The bear sat in the plastic tray on the conveyor belt, tucked beside his phone, keys, and a small bottle of pills. Under the cold light, its fur looked duller, the worn patches more obvious. Next to metal objects and glass screens, the toy seemed both out of place and somehow the most honest thing there. He watched it roll away from him on the belt, pass through the dark mouth of the scanner. For a second, he had the irrational fear that a siren would sound, that some hidden sensor would recognize what the bear meant and drag it back. Nothing happened. The border official watching the monitor barely glanced at the blurred outline on his screen. To him, the bear was just another soft shape to be checked for hidden electronics or blades. It registered as fabric and stuffing, then vanished into the endless sequence of harmless items. Remy moved forward when the line jerked. The people ahead took off belts, emptied pockets, slipped off shoes. He did the same, movement slowed by the pull in his abdomen and the dull ache in his lower back. The metal frame of the detector loomed in front of him like a doorway to somewhere he was not sure he wanted to go. Step through, the guard said, neutral. He walked under the arch. The machine stayed silent. No alarm. No demand to go back and empty more of himself into the tray. On the other side, he waited for his things. The trays emerged one after another, pushed by the conveyor's steady crawl. Phones, laptops, bags, a pair of children's shoes. Then his own container slid out, the bear on top, half tipped over by the journey. He reached for it before anything else, fingers closing a little too tightly around its small body. Only after that did he gather the rest. Phone. Wallet. The folder of documents he felt he could not afford to drop, as if the story they told might shatter if it hit the floor. The next line led to the booths where passports were checked. Here the atmosphere changed slightly. The noise hushed itself, as if people instinctively lowered their voices in front of the glass partitions and the authority behind them. The light was even colder in this section, reflecting off polished counters and the faint sheen of the floor. He stepped into one of the lines and waited. At the neighboring booths, he heard snippets of routine questions spoken in different accents. Purpose of your trip? How long will you stay? Where will you be staying? Stamps thudded against paper at irregular intervals, each one sealing another passage. His turn came with no ceremony. The officer behind the glass held out a hand without really looking up. Passport. Remy slid the document under the slot. For a moment his fingers resisted letting go, as if a small part of him believed that as long as he kept physical contact with this booklet, he could still choose not to cross. Then it was on the other side. Out of his reach, the officer opened it, the pages flicking under his thumb. He studied the photo, then looked up briefly, comparing features with the image. The scrutiny was professional and distant. No curiosity, no suspicion beyond the standard. Remy felt his heartbeat climb anyway. The world narrowed to the sound of pages turning and the click of a keyboard as the officer checked something on his screen. Some part of him waited for a question that would slice through the official story. Where are you really going? Who are you leaving behind? Why do your hands shake? None came. The officer found the necessary page and raised the stamp. For a fraction of a second, Remy saw the rubber face move through the air in slow motion, a small block of authority about to mark his exit. The impact of stamp on paper felt louder than the low murmur of the hall. The sound traveled through his body, a dull, decisive thud. On the page, a small rectangle of ink appeared, lines and letters fixing the date and place of departure. It was just one more mark among many, but it redrew his inner map. Until this moment, in theory, he could have turned around, gone back, admitted he was not ready. Now, a system larger than him had recorded that he was leaving. Turning back would no longer be a simple act of will. It would be an exception, a disruption. The officer slid the passport back under the glass, already lifting his eyes to the next traveler. Next. The word was not meant for him anymore. Remy took the document, its weight unchanged and entirely different. He stepped aside, moving with the sluggish momentum of someone walking underwater. Around him, people shuffled forward, filling the space he left, their own small dramas wrapped in ordinary clothing. He reached the end of the controlled area, where benches lined the wall and screens showed departure information in stark letters. For a moment he stopped there, out of the main flow. The border hall spread out around him, all straight lines and controlled paths, designed to move bodies efficiently from one jurisdiction to another. He looked down at what he held: passport, folder, bag strap digging into his shoulder, and in his other arm, the bear, its head resting against his wrist. It was the only thing no one had checked for stamps or visas, the only thing that had passed through all the machines and gates without anyone asking why he carried it. In a place defined by regulations and forms, the toy had become the quietest kind of contraband. It smuggled through something that could not be declared in any box on any card. The fact that somewhere, on the other side of the ink on his exit stamp, there was a child whose first days had begun with his heartbeat close by. He tightened his grip for a second, then drew a breath and turned toward the gate that would take him out of this hall and into the next stretch of his exile, carrying with him the one object that still refused to be reduced to lines on a page. When he stepped out of the border hall into the area that technically belonged to another country, the air felt different. The temperature was almost the same, the humidity familiar, but something in the texture of it had shifted. Maybe it was only the story he attached to each breath. Behind him lay a city that had been his golden cage. Behind him lay documents in a safe and on servers bearing his signature under renunciation. Behind him lay a nursery where, at this very moment, a newborn might be sleeping. Behind him lay a man who had always combined power and control with a strange, possessive care in which love fought constantly with the need to hold on. Ahead, fluorescent lights gave way to softer illumination from large glass windows. The airport's public zone opened into a space of shops, signs pointing to arrivals and departures, people dragging suitcases, screens ticking over with destinations. It was a nowhere place, designed to be passed through, not inhabited. A corridor between lives. Remy did not go all the way in at once. He stopped in a small recess between the exit from the controlled area and the wide hall beyond. Here, tucked slightly out of the flow, he could stand without being jostled. Travelers moved past him in both directions, some hurrying, some wandering, some pausing to take photos of the boards with their shifting lists of flights. For them, this spot was a waypoint at best, a point they would not remember in a week. For him, it was a line, not painted on the floor or drawn on a map, but felt in the way his body did not quite know whether to step forward or turn around. This was the narrow strip where two versions of his life touched and then parted. He held the teddy bear in both hands. The toy had not been meant for him. It had once belonged to a boy who had grown up to be Lion. It had then been placed on a shelf for a child who would now carry Lion's name and story. Remy had been allowed to take it as a concession, an item of emotional support. Now it sat between his palms, lighter than air, and somehow heavier than everything else he carried. He looked down at it, and, for a moment, the present dissolved into fragments of the path that had led here, a marble bathroom and two quick lines appearing on a cheap test. The view from the penthouse windows, the city spread out like a promise he could never touch. The cold feeling of the safe door that still held his old passport, metal and code and ownership. The muted tone of doctors in a softly lit room, talking about him as a variable in a report, not as a person breaking along silent seams. The nursery, with its pale crib and tidy shelves, where he had stood too long in front of a row of toys, choosing the one object he was permitted to carry into exile, all of that condensed now into the soft weight against his fingers. People brushed by his little island of stillness, the wheels of their bags clicking over the tiles. An announcement rang out in two languages, boarding for some faraway flight. A child laughed somewhere behind him, high and sharp, the sound slicing clean through the airport murmur before dissolving into it again. Life moved, indifferent to the fact that his world had just come apart and reassembled in a different shape. He stood on the border, both physical and inner, trying to hold two truths at once without letting either of them consume him. The first truth was that he was finally free in the way he had once imagined while watching the streets from high above. He had a key in his pocket to a door that would only open from the inside, his inside. He had a ticket folded in his coat, pointing him toward a city where no one knew his history. He could, for the first time in years, choose what work he did, where he lived, who he allowed near. The second truth was that a part of him would never fully leave that other house. There, in a nursery, he could picture in perfect detail, even with his eyes closed, a child would grow up carrying another surname, another version of the story. They would learn to stand holding on to those pale crib bars, to walk across that carefully chosen rug, to sleep under a mobile he had once watched turning in the quiet. On some shelf, new toys would appear, given by other hands. In some framed photo, they would be caught between an alpha father and maybe another careful, acceptable adult. He would not be there. Freedom, he realized, was not a clean victory here, not a shining prize he could hold up without shaking. It was not absolute loss either. It was something more difficult to name, a complicated, ambiguous point on a line where a person admitted that sometimes choices were not between good and bad, but between two kinds of pain. He had chosen the one he believed his child would suffer from least. He knew too well what chaos did to a small life. The institutional rooms of his own past came back in flashes, the smell of boiled vegetables, the echo of footsteps in long corridors, the way staff changed every few months, and with them, the rules. He remembered learning early that adults left, that those who stayed did not always stay for good reasons. He remembered promising himself, in childish words, that if he ever had a say, he would not drag a child through that kind of storm for the sake of his own pride. He could have stayed and fought. There were paths where he refused to sign, where he tried to drag Lion into court or into some drawn-out war of rights. Those paths glinted in his imagination in a certain heroic light. But when he followed them further, he saw lawyers tearing at the story, saw his own past used to paint him as unstable, saw headlines with the child's name hidden but not well enough, saw threats and counter-threats bouncing between alphas whose patience wore thin. He saw the child in the middle of it, pulled and pushed and watched, an object, never just a person. He had chosen another way, to step out quietly, like a man leaving through a service exit, not because he did not care, but because he cared enough to accept being the one who bore the cut most directly. In the small niche outside the border hall, with the bear in his hands and the murmur of an unfamiliar terminal around him, he felt that cut as a living thing. He did not romanticize it. This was not the ending of a beautiful film, with music swelling and a clear moral stamped on the last frame. It was raw, awkward, too bright under the airport lights. His scar ached, his eyes burned, but stubbornly did not spill over. His future was a set of unknown streets and blank days that he would have to fill from scratch one by one. He adjusted his grip on the bear, feeling the worn fabric yield under his fingers, and finally took a step toward the main hall. The automatic doors sighed open in front of him. Voices grew louder. Screens flashed flight numbers and times. Somewhere ahead, beyond this building, lay a train, a car, another threshold, and eventually a modest apartment where he would lay this toy down on a shelf and begin teaching himself how to live as someone who belonged only to himself. Behind him, in a country he had just left in ink, and in fact, a baby slept, unconcerned with borders or contracts. Two worlds, linked by one small object, and a man who would spend years learning how to stand with a foot in each without breaking completely. If you have stayed with this story to the very end, remind yourself that not all escapes look like they do in beautiful movies. Sometimes they happen in a quiet border hall where a person stands under cold lights, clutching a toy, knowing they have left a piece of themselves on the other side of the glass. Tell me in the comments how you understand freedom in a situation like this. Is it a victory or a wound you learn to live with? And whom do you see as stronger here? The Omega who walked away, giving up his child to keep that small life out of the chaos that shaped his own? Or the Alpha who opened the door and let him go, though he could have tightened the cage? Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription, so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even the most painful decisions can become the beginning of another, more honest life.